It was supposed to be a routine intimidation, a brutal power trip on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Two arrogant patrolmen threw a black man onto the scorching asphalt, laughing as the steel handcuffs clicked tight. They thought he was just another nobody. They thought they owned the streets. They had no idea the man bleeding on their hood was a seasoned federal agent wearing a wire, and in exactly 6 hours, 17 badges would be stripped, and their city would burn $10 million trying to cover up the ashes. The late August heat in the industrial district of Monroe City was relentless, baking the cracked concrete until the air above it shimmered like liquid glass. It was the kind of heat that made tempers run notoriously short, the kind of oppressive weather where bad decisions were made in the blink of an eye. Special Agent Daniel Brooks sat on a bus bench at the corner of 5th and Elm, holding a half-empty bottle of generic iced tea, the condensation dripping down his knuckles. To the naked eye, Daniel was just a man waiting for the 3:15 transit line. He wore faded denim jeans, a plain, slightly oversized grey t-shirt, and a pair of worn-out work boots. A faded baseball cap was pulled low over his eyes, casting a shadow over his sharp, observant features. But Daniel wasn't waiting for a bus. He was waiting for a trap to snap shut. For the past 8 months, the Department of Justice had been quietly building a sprawling civil rights and corruption case against the Monroe City Police Department, specifically the notorious 9th Precinct. The complaints had been piling up for years: illegal search and seizures, systematic racial profiling, fabricated evidence, and a brutal enforcement squad that operated more like a sanctioned street gang than a law enforcement agency. The local government had continuously turned a blind eye, sweeping lawsuits under the rug with hush money and non-disclosure agreements. The FBI had decided enough was enough. They initiated Operation Glasshouse. Daniel Brooks was one of the Bureau's finest deep-cover operatives. A 15-year veteran of the FBI with a background in the military police, Daniel possessed an unnerving ability to remain absolutely calm in the face of chaos. He was chosen for this specific field test because he fit the exact demographic the 9th Precinct targeted with ruthless efficiency. His mission today was simple: exist in public, mind his own business, and wait to see if the local patrol units took the bait. Beneath the collar of his grey t-shirt, completely invisible to a casual observer, was a state-of-the-art micro-recording device. It wasn't just capturing audio, it was transmitting a live feed directly to an unmarked surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, where Supervising Agent Thomas Reed and a team of federal technicians were monitoring his vitals and his surroundings. "We have movement on your 6, Daniel." Reed's voice crackled softly through the microscopic earpiece nestled deep in Daniel's right ear. "Monroe PD cruiser, Unit 4 Bravo, turning onto Elm. Looks like they're slowing down." Daniel didn't turn his head. He took a slow sip of his iced tea. "Copy that," he murmured, his lips barely moving. "Let's see if they play the hits." The black and white Ford Explorer crept down the street, its tires crunching over loose gravel and broken glass. Inside were officers Ryan Jensen and Thomas Miller. Jensen, the driver, was a 5-year veteran, known to internal affairs, but somehow always cleared of wrongdoing. Miller, his partner, had a reputation for an explosive temper and a profound sense of untouchable arrogance. Daniel watched their reflection in the dirty window of the pawn shop across the street. The cruiser rolled past him, paused, and then the brake lights flared a blinding red. The vehicle aggressively reversed, the engine whining, before jerking to a halt right at the curb, just inches from Daniel's boots. The heavy, suffocating silence of the street was shattered by the crackle of the police radio, echoing from the open windows of the cruiser. Daniel kept his eyes fixed forward, his posture relaxed, his heart rate steady. He had been in cartel safe-houses and high-stakes hostage negotiations. Two bigoted beat cops weren't going to make him flinch. The heavy doors of the cruiser swung open. Boots hit the pavement. The game was on. "Hey, you, on the bench." The voice belonged to Officer Miller. It was sharp, authoritative, and laced with the kind of immediate hostility that demanded submission. Daniel turned his head slowly, raising an eyebrow in feigned confusion. "Me?" he asked, his tone perfectly even, polite but not subservient. "Yeah, you. Stand up. Hands out of your pockets," Jensen barked, rounding the front of the vehicle. He rested his right hand casually on the butt of his service weapon, a classic intimidation tactic designed to escalate the tension instantly. Daniel stood up slowly, ensuring his movements were telegraphed and non-threatening. He left the bottle of iced tea on the wooden slats of the bench. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We're asking the questions," Miller snapped, stepping onto the curb and closing the distance. He looked Daniel up and down, a sneer twisting his features. "What are you doing out here?" "Waiting for the bus," Daniel replied calmly. "Bus doesn't run for another 20 minutes, Jensen countered, stepping up to flank Daniel on his left. "You look a little lost. Or maybe you're looking for something else. You got ID on you?" Legally in this state, an officer needed reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime was being committed to demand identification. Waiting for a bus in broad daylight did not meet that standard. Daniel knew the law backward and forward, but asserting his rights was exactly what these officers hated the most. "I don't think I've done anything wrong, officers," Daniel said, his voice smooth, steady. "I'm just sitting here. Am I suspected of committing a crime?" The air seemed to freeze. The question, a standard assertion of constitutional rights, was treated like an act of severe aggression. Miller's face flushed red, the veins in his neck bulging slightly. He wasn't used to defiance. He was used to fear. "Oh, we got a constitutional scholar here," Miller mocked, taking another aggressive step forward, violating Daniel's personal space. "I said, give me your ID now, or we're going to have a major problem. Under the Fourth Amendment, unless you have reasonable suspicion." Daniel didn't get to finish his sentence. Without warning, Miller lunged forward, grabbing the front of Daniel's t-shirt in his massive fists. With a violent jerk, he spun Daniel around and slammed him face first into the scorching metal hood of the police cruiser. The impact was brutal, knocking the breath out of Daniel's lungs. The metal burned against his cheek, the intense summer sun having essentially turned the vehicle into a frying pan. "Stop resisting! Quit resisting!" Jensen started screaming, despite Daniel not moving a single muscle in opposition. It was the standard theater, the verbal cover story performed for any imaginary witnesses or body cameras, though both officers had conveniently forgotten to activate theirs. "I am not resisting," Daniel stated, his voice muffled against the hood, yet somehow still perfectly composed. "I am completely compliant." "Shut your mouth!" Miller roared. He grabbed Daniel's left arm, wrenching it up behind his back with enough force to strain the rotator cuff. A second later, the cold, heavy steel of a handcuff ratcheted tightly around Daniel's wrist, biting into his skin. Jensen grabbed the right arm, yanked it back, and secured the second cuff. Daniel felt a sharp knee drive into the back of his thigh. "Widen your stance," Jensen ordered, kicking Daniel's ankles apart. They began to forcefully pat him down. Miller's hands roughly searched Daniel's pockets. He pulled out Daniel's cheap burner phone and a worn leather wallet that contained Daniel's undercover alias, ID. Daniel Barnes, an independent contractor. "You think you can run your mouth to us?" Miller hissed, leaning in close, his hot breath smelling of stale coffee and tobacco. "You think you own this sidewalk? You don't know who you're dealing with, boy. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Daniel thought to himself. And you have absolutely no idea what you've just done. Through the hidden earpiece, Reed's voice was tense but professional. Daniel, we have it all. Unlawful detainment, excessive force, civil rights violations under color of law. Do you need us to move in? Daniel tapped his index finger against the hood of the car twice, a prearranged signal. Hold position. Let them dig the hole deeper. Stand him up, Miller grunted. They yanked Daniel off the hood by the chain of his handcuffs, a move designed to inflict maximum pain. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing his expression to remain impassive. He looked directly into Miller's eyes. There was no fear in Daniel's gaze, only a cold, analytical calculation. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, unnerved by the absolute lack of panic in the man he was assaulting, but arrogance quickly overrode his instinct. Get in the car. Jensen shoved Daniel roughly toward the back door of the cruiser. Daniel ducked his head and slid into the suffocating, plastic-lined back seat of the vehicle. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside the claustrophobic cage. As the two officers climbed into the front seats, laughing and congratulating themselves on their swift takedown of a suspect, Daniel leaned his head back against the hard plastic divider. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. The officers had locked themselves inside it and handed him the key. The air conditioning in the back of the cruiser was practically non-existent. The smell of old sweat, vomit, and industrial cleaner clung to the thick plexiglass divider separating Daniel from his captors. In the front seat, Miller was casually flipping through Daniel's decoy wallet. Daniel Barnes, Miller read aloud, tossing the fake driver's license onto the dashboard. No outstanding warrants, clean record. Looks like we just caught ourselves a smart aleck who needed an attitude adjustment. What are we booking him on? Jensen asked, steering the heavy vehicle aggressively through the afternoon traffic, hitting the siren purely to force a minivan out of their way. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order. Miller rattled off the charges with practiced ease. It was the unholy trinity of fabricated offenses used by corrupt cops to justify illegal arrests. By the time he makes bail tomorrow morning, he'll have learned to keep his mouth shut when a badge asks him a question. Daniel sat perfectly still, letting his silence fill the back of the car. In his experience, corrupt officers hated silence. It deprived them of the power dynamic they craved. They wanted begging. They wanted anger. They wanted anything they could use to justify their violence. You got nothing to say now, counselor? Miller sneered, looking at Daniel through the rearview mirror. Lost your voice? You were full of the Constitution 5 minutes ago. Daniel met Miller's eyes in the mirror. I'm just looking forward to making my phone call, officer. Miller let out a short, bark-like laugh. You'll get your call when we say you get your call. You're on our time now. The cruiser pulled into the heavily fortified back lot of the Monroe City 9th Precinct. The building was a brutalist block of concrete, surrounded by razor wire and decaying brick walls. It was a place where civil rights went to die, a black hole of accountability. They dragged Daniel out of the car, practically carrying him by the handcuffs up the concrete steps and through the heavy steel doors into the intake area. The precinct was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the metallic clanging of cell doors. At the raised booking desk sat Sergeant Douglas Morris. Morris was a 20-year veteran, a man who had built a career on looking the other way. He was the gatekeeper of the 9th Precinct's dirty secrets. "What have we got, Miller?" Morris asked, barely looking up from his paperwork, adjusting his glasses. "Found him loitering on 5th. Refused to ID, got combative, resisted arrest." Miller lied effortlessly, slapping Daniel's decoy wallet onto the high desk. "Usual garbage," Morris sighed, finally looking down at Daniel. "Name?" Daniel stared at the sergeant. I have already been illegally searched. My identification is on the desk. I am formally requesting a supervisor, and I am invoking my right to remain silent until I am permitted a phone call." Morris paused. He narrowed his eyes. The script was off. Usually the people Miller dragged in were screaming obscenities or crying. This man was standing straight, speaking with the clinical precision of a lawyer. "You're looking at a supervisor, buddy," Morris said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And right now, you are a John Doe in my jail until I decide to process you. Empty his pockets and put him in holding cell 3. Let him cool off." Jensen and Miller shoved Daniel into a small, windowless concrete room that smelled sharply of urine and bleach. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The electronic deadbolt clacked into place. Daniel was alone. His hands were still cuffed behind his back, a blatant violation of protocol for a holding cell, meant purely as a punitive measure. Through the hidden earpiece, Agent Reed's voice was crisp. "Daniel, tracking shows you are inside the precinct. We have the assault and the false booking on tape. The director is authorizing Phase 2. Give the word." Daniel maneuvered himself so his back was against the cold concrete wall. He slid down until he was sitting on the metal bench. He couldn't speak aloud in the echoing cell, but he tapped the side of his leg twice. "Procedure." 3 miles away, in a secure federal building, a switch was flipped. The sting was no longer just an observation mission. It was an execution order. Dozens of federal agents in tactical gear, armed with federal indictments, signed by a federal judge, began to load into heavily armored black SUVs. Back at the booking desk, Sergeant Morris was slowly typing up the arrest report for Daniel Barnes, laughing at a joke Miller had just made about the arrest. They thought they had 6 hours until shift change. They thought they had the rest of the night to torture a civilian. They didn't know that the FBI had just set a timer. And when that timer hit 0, the 9th precinct was going to be ripped apart down to the foundations. The clock was ticking. 2 hours dragged by inside holding cell 3. The temperature in the windowless concrete box hovered near 90 degrees, the ventilation system having failed sometime during the previous decade. Special Agent Daniel Brooks remained seated on the unyielding metal bench, his hands still securely manacled behind his back. The steel cuffs had long since bitten through the top layer of skin on his wrists, sending sharp, stinging pulses of pain up his forearms with every microscopic movement. Yet, his breathing remained deep and rhythmic. He was conserving energy, mapping the psychological profile of the precinct through the muted sounds bleeding through the heavy steel door. He could hear the distant, arrogant laughter of Officer Miller echoing from the bullpen. He could hear the weary, defeated sobs of another prisoner a few cells down. It was the soundtrack of a slaughterhouse run by wolves. Suddenly, the heavy deadbolt outside his cell disengaged with a loud metallic clack. The door swung outward, groaning on rusted hinges. Standing in the threshold wasn't Miller or Jensen. It was a man in a rumpled, ill-fitting beige suit, his tie loosened around a thick neck. He had the hollow, dead eyes of a man who had traded his conscience for a pension years ago. This was Detective Simon Trent. In the intricate ecosystem of the corrupt 9th Precinct, Trent was the apex predator's designated cleaner. Whenever a patrolman beat a suspect a little too severely, or whenever a search was conducted without a shred of a warrant, Trent was the man who miraculously produced the paperwork, the anonymous tips, and the manufactured confessions to make it all perfectly legal. "Get up, Barnes," Trent ordered, his voice a raspy smoker's growl. Daniel didn't move immediately. He locked eyes with the detective, holding the gaze just long enough to establish that he was not intimidated, before slowly rising to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulders. Trent grabbed Daniel by the bicep, his grip unnecessarily tight, and steered him out of the holding area and down a dimly lit, narrow corridor. They bypassed the standard interview rooms, the ones equipped with functioning, digitally backed-up cameras and microphones. Instead, Trent shoved Daniel through an unmarked wooden door at the very end of the hall. It was an old storage closet that had been converted into an interrogation room. A single, flickering fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, jaundiced light over a scratched aluminum table and two mismatched chairs. There were no cameras here. There were no audio recorders. This was the sweat box, a room where the Constitution held absolutely no jurisdiction. Trent forced Daniel down into one of the chairs and took a seat across from him, dropping a manila folder onto the table with a heavy thud. For a long moment, the detective said nothing. He simply stared at Daniel, attempting to employ the power of silence. It was a rookie interrogation tactic. Daniel could have sat in that silence for 3 days without flinching. "You're a cool customer, I'll give you that," Trent finally muttered, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Miller tells me you were spouting off about the Fourth Amendment before you decided to take a swing at him." "I never swung at anyone," Daniel replied, his voice perfectly level, the microscopic wire still actively transmitting every syllable to the FBI command center. "I was assaulted without provocation, illegally detained, and my rights have been systematically violated since the moment your officers stepped out of their vehicle." Trent let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Yeah. Save the courtroom dramatics. We're not in front of a judge, Barnes. We're in my house. And in my house, I write the narrative." Trent opened the manila folder. Inside was a single, pre-typed sheet of paper. He spun it around and slid it across the aluminum table toward Daniel. "This is a standard confession and waiver of rights," Trent explained, tapping the paper with a thick index finger. "It says that you admit to being intoxicated in public, that you initiated physical contact with Officer Miller, and that you sustained your current injuries. When you tripped and fell against the police cruiser while resisting a lawful arrest. You signed this. I process you for a simple misdemeanor, and you're out of here by midnight. You don't sign it." Trent leaned forward, his dead eyes narrowing into a vicious squint. "And I promise you, what happened on that street is going to feel like a massage compared to what happens in this room." "I can't sign it," Daniel said simply. "My hands are cuffed behind my back." Trent smiled, an ugly, predatory expression. "I'll uncuff you the second you agree to put pen to paper. I am not signing a fabricated document, detective." Trent slammed his fist onto the table, the metallic bang echoing in the small room. "You stupid, arrogant piece of—" The door suddenly flew open, cutting Trent off. Officer Jensen stood in the doorway. The smug, untouchable aura he had carried on the street was completely gone. His face was entirely drained of color, his skin a sickening shade of ash. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or worse, his own impending doom. "Detective Trent," Jensen stammered, his voice trembling violently. Can I see you in the hall for a second?" Trent scowled, irritated by the interruption. "I'm in the middle of an interview, Jensen." "What is it?" "It's about his prints," Jensen said, his eyes darting nervously toward Daniel. "You need to see this. Now." Trent let out an exasperated sigh, stood up, and followed the patrolman out of the room, leaving the door cracked open an inch. Daniel sat in the flickering light, listening intently. Through the crack in the door, he could hear the frantic, hushed whispers of the corrupt cops. "What the hell is the matter with you, Jensen?" Trent hissed. "You look like you're going to vomit." "I ran his prints through the AFIS terminal," Jensen whispered, panic completely consuming his voice. Standard booking procedure. I put his fingers on the glass, hit enter, and waited for the local database match. And did he pop for outstanding warrants? Is he a felon? No. Jensen swallowed hard. The screen went completely black. Then a red banner flashed across the entire monitor. It locked me out of the terminal. The message said, "Restricted access. Department of Defense / Federal Bureau of Investigation. Clearance level Alpha required. Do not detain. Initiate immediate contact with DOJ protocol officer." There was a long, suffocating silence in the hallway. "Are you out of your mind?" Trent demanded, his voice dropping to a terrified rasp. "A federal lock? You're telling me we just snatched up a Fed?" "I don't know." Jensen was hyperventilating now. Maybe he's a high-level cartel informant in witness protection. Maybe he's a spook. But whoever he is, Simon, he's not Daniel Barnes, the contractor. We put hands on him. Miller slammed him into the hood. We brought him in without probable cause. If the feds are watching him... "Shut up! Shut your mouth right now!" Trent snapped, attempting to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling into a catastrophic nightmare. If he was an active agent, they would have stepped in on the street. He's got to be a snitch, a high-value city eye. The feds leave their CIs hanging in the wind all the time. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Heavy, authoritative steps. "What is going on here?" a new voice demanded. It was a deep, commanding baritone that commanded absolute terror within the 9th Precinct. "Captain Briggs," Trent said, his voice instantly deferential. Captain Edward Briggs was the architect of the precinct's misery. A physically imposing man with a meticulously tailored uniform and a chest full of commendations he had largely stolen or fabricated, Briggs ran his district like a feudal lord. He had the mayor in his pocket, several judges on his payroll, and a belief that he was entirely above the law. "Jensen just ran the John Doe's prints, Captain," Trent explained quickly. "The system threw up a federal firewall, high-level restriction. We think he might be a protected federal asset." Briggs didn't say a word. He pushed past the detective and the patrolman, shoving the door to the interrogation room wide open. He stepped inside, his massive frame seemingly filling the small space. He stared down at Daniel, evaluating him with the cold, calculating eyes of a butcher examining a piece of meat. Daniel looked back at the captain. He recognized Briggs instantly from the massive dossier back at the field office. This was the primary target. The head of the snake. "So," Briggs murmured, circling the aluminum table slowly. "You're not a nobody. You belong to the alphabet boys." Daniel maintained his silence, offering the corrupt captain absolutely nothing. Briggs stopped behind Daniel, placing his heavy hands on the back of the metal chair. "Here is the problem with federal assets, Mr. Barnes. They think they have a golden ticket. They think Washington is going to swoop down and save them. But Washington is very far away from Monroe City. Down here, in the basement of this building, I am God." Briggs leaned down, his mouth right next to Daniel's ear. "I have built a $10 million operation in this city. Extortion, narcotics protection, illegal seizures. I own the streets. I am not going to let a single, misplaced rat tear down my empire." Briggs stood up and turned to Trent, who was hovering nervously in the doorway. "Wipe the booking logs," Briggs ordered, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "Delete the AFIS query from the server cache. Take his fake ID and burn it." "Captain?" Trent asked, his eyes widening. "What are we doing?" "This man was never here," Briggs stated coldly. "He never existed. He wasn't arrested on 5th and Elm. He was never brought into the 9th. Miller and Jensen are going to take him out the back service elevator. They are going to drive him out to the abandoned rail yard on the county line." Jensen let out a choked gasp. "Captain, we can't!" A federal lock! If they find his body... Briggs whipped around, grabbing Jensen by the throat and slamming him against the cinder-block wall. You will do exactly as I say, or you will be in the trunk of the car right next to him. Do you understand me? We execute him. We burn the teeth and fingertips, and we dump him in the quarry. It's the only way to sever the tie. If he leaves this building breathing, we all go to federal prison for the rest of our lives. Briggs released the gasping patrolman and turned back to Daniel, drawing his heavy steel collapsible baton from his belt. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the weapon extended with a terrifying metallic crack. No more games, Briggs sneered, stepping toward the chained FBI agent. Let's see how tough the feds really are when the cameras are off. Supervisory Agent Reed, Code Red, Code Red, immediate breach authorized. Daniel spoke the words in a calm, clear, devastatingly steady voice. Captain Briggs froze, his baton raised halfway in the air. He looked around the barren room, genuinely confused. Who the hell are you talking to? You think you have a wire? We swept you. We took your phone. Daniel tilted his head slightly, locking his eyes directly onto the corrupt captains. The illusion of the helpless victim vanished entirely, replaced by the hardened, lethal glare of a Tier 1 federal operative. I'm not talking to a wire, Edward, Daniel said softly. I'm talking directly to the Reaper, and he's at your front door. You arrogant piece of... Briggs roared, swinging the steel baton down toward Daniel's skull. The baton never made contact. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't an announcement. It was the sound of the end of the world. A deafening, catastrophic explosion rocked the entire foundation of the 9th Precinct. The impact was so violently concussive that the flickering fluorescent light in the interrogation room shattered, raining sparks and glass down onto the aluminum table. Dust and plaster exploded from the ceiling. Outside the precinct, a 15-ton Lenco Bearcat armored vehicle, painted matte black with FBI SWAT, stenciled in massive white letters on the side, had just driven straight through the precinct's reinforced steel rear gate at 40 miles an hour, crumpling the barricade like aluminum foil. Simultaneously, a second armored breach vehicle ripped the front glass doors of the lobby completely off their hinges. FBI, nobody move! Show your hands! Show your hands! The screams echoed through the building, amplified by megaphones and backed by the terrifying, synchronized stomping of heavy tactical boots. Inside the precinct's bullpen, absolute pandemonium erupted. Stun grenades, flashbangs were tossed through the shattered windows, detonating with blinding, ear-splitting fury. The concussive blasts incapacitated the corrupt officers instantly, leaving them staggering, deafened, and blinded. Sergeant Douglas Morris, the gatekeeper at the booking desk who had arrogantly thrown Daniel into the cell, panicked. He reached for his holstered service weapon. Before his fingers could even graze the leather of his holster, the red dots of 14 laser sights materialized on his chest, painting his uniform like a target. "Touch that weapon and you're dead before you hit the floor, Sergeant," roared a tactical operator, his M4 rifle leveled directly at Morris's head. Morris threw his hands into the air, falling to his knees and weeping openly, his tough guy facade shattering into dust. Back in the interrogation room, the world had descended into chaos. Captain Briggs had dropped his baton, the color entirely draining from his face as the unmistakable sounds of a massive federal siege echoed down the hallway. He looked at Daniel, then at the door, the realization of his catastrophic mistake finally crashing down upon him. You're an agent," Briggs stammered, his voice nothing but a hollow wheeze. "Special Agent Daniel Brooks, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Daniel replied calmly, still sitting perfectly still in the dark. "And you, Captain, are under arrest for conspiracy, civil rights violations, attempted murder, and racketeering." Officer Jensen turned to run. He made it exactly 2 steps out the door of the interrogation room before he collided with a wall of black Kevlar. 2 massive FBI SWAT operators drove their riot shields directly into Jensen, launching him backward. He hit the cinder-block wall with a sickening crunch and crumpled to the linoleum floor, instantly restrained and zip-tied. Detective Trent threw his hands up, falling to his stomach on the floor, screaming, "I surrender! I surrender! I didn't touch him! It was Briggs! It was Briggs!" Captain Briggs, cornered and desperate, took a step backward, his eyes darting wildly for an exit that didn't exist. A tall man wearing a navy blue FBI windbreaker stepped through the doorway, flanking the heavily armed SWAT operators. He possessed an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. This was Supervisory Special Agent Thomas Reed. Reed ignored the whimpering officers on the floor. He walked directly to the aluminum table and looked down at Briggs. "Captain Edward Briggs," Reed said, his voice cold as liquid nitrogen. "You are relieved of your command." 2 operators flanked Briggs, grabbing his arms and violently forcing him to his knees. They ripped his service weapon from his belt and slammed heavy steel federal handcuffs over his wrists, locking them with a finality that echoed in the small room. Reed pulled a small silver key from his pocket. He walked behind Daniel and inserted it into the cuffs that had been grinding into Daniel's flesh for the past 3 hours. With a click, the pressure vanished. Daniel stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders and rubbing the raw, bleeding skin of his wrists. He looked down at Briggs, who was now kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the ruins of his corrupt empire. "You think this means anything?" Briggs spat, blood trickling from his lip where he had bitten it in terror. "I know the mayor. I know the district attorney. You can't hold me." Agent Reed chuckled softly. He pulled a thick, folded document from his jacket pocket and dropped it onto the floor right in front of Briggs's knees. "That is a 72-page federal indictment," Reed stated, "signed by a federal grand jury an hour ago. We didn't just wire up Agent Brooks. We wired your office. We wired your patrol cars. We seized offshore bank accounts 30 minutes ago. Mayor John Stanton is currently being placed in handcuffs by another tactical team at his country club for accepting your bribe money." Briggs stared at the document, his bravado finally breaking. The reality of his absolute destruction was setting in. "We didn't just come for you, Edward," Daniel added, walking past the kneeling captain. "We came for the entire precinct. Every single officer who looked the other way, every patrolman who falsified a report, every detective who covered up a beating." Daniel stopped at the doorway and looked back at the terrified, pathetic men who had thought they were untouchable gods just a few hours prior. 17 badges, Daniel said quietly. 17 federal warrants. Your reign is over. As Daniel walked out of the interrogation room and down the hallway, the scene was one of total capitulation. The untouchable officers of the 9th Precinct were lined up against the walls, stripped of their weapons, their badges ripped from their chests, and their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Officer Miller, the man who had slammed Daniel onto the hood of the cruiser, was sobbing uncontrollably as an FBI agent read him his Miranda rights. Operation Glass House was a complete and total success. In exactly 6 hours, a rogue police force had kidnapped a federal agent, threatened his life, and in doing so, handed the Department of Justice the exact ammunition they needed to burn their corrupt syndicate to the ground. It was a day the city would never forget. And as Daniel walked out of the shattered front doors of the precinct and into the fading evening light, he knew the real work. The trials, the testimonies, the dismantling of the rotten foundation was only just beginning. But for tonight, the wolves had been caged, and the streets belonged to the law once again. The morning after Operation Glass House, The sun rose over Monroe City to illuminate a drastically altered landscape of power. Inside the sterile, heavily fortified basement of the federal courthouse, the atmosphere was a chilling departure from the chaotic, blood-stained bravado of the 9th Precinct. Here, there were no rusty metal benches or flickering fluorescent lights. Everything was immaculate white tile, polished steel, and absolute, crushing silence. 17 men who had worn the badge like a crown of absolute impunity the day before were now stripped of their armor. They wore identical, oversized orange jumpsuits. They had no shoelaces, no belts, and no authority. For the first time in their adult lives, they were entirely at the mercy of a justice system they had spent decades manipulating and mocking. The strategy of the Department of Justice was not merely to prosecute, it was to annihilate the syndicate from the inside out, utilizing the very cowardice that bullies always harbor beneath their uniforms. Assistant United States Attorney Margaret Donovan was tasked with breaking them. Donovan was a legal surgeon with a reputation for merciless precision. She didn't yell, she didn't threaten, and she never bluffed. She walked into interrogation room A, carrying a stack of files nearly 2 feet high. Sitting across from her, trembling so violently his handcuffs rattled against the table, was Officer Ryan Jensen. "Good morning, Mr. Jensen," Donovan said, her voice perfectly even as she laid the first file on the table. She purposefully omitted his title. He was no longer an officer. He was a defendant. Jensen looked up, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of abject terror. I want to make a deal. I didn't want to hurt the agent. I just drove the car. It was Miller. It was Captain Briggs. Briggs was the one who said we had to kill him. Donovan opened the file, sliding an 8x10 glossy photograph across the table. It was a surveillance still of Jensen, aggressively yanking Daniel Brooks's arms behind his back. Federal sentencing guidelines for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law carry a mandatory minimum of 25 years to life, Donovan stated, her tone as casual as if she were reading a weather report. You are 32 years old. If you go to trial, you will die in a federal penitentiary. Jensen buried his face in his manacled hands, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. Please, I have a little girl. Your allegiance to Edward Briggs ended the moment the FBI breached your building, Donovan continued, leaning forward slightly. In the next room, Detective Trent is currently looking at the exact same paperwork. Whoever signs a proffer agreement first gets 5 to 10 years in a low-security facility. The second man to sign gets 20. The third gets life. I only need one cooperating witness, Mr. Jensen. Who is it going to be? It took Jensen less than 40 seconds to pick up the pen and sign his life away, offering up every dirty secret, every buried body, and every stolen dollar the 9th Precinct had ever touched. While the dominoes were falling in the federal holding cells, absolute panic was consuming Monroe City Hall. Mayor John Stanton was already sitting in a holding cell facing his own federal extortion charges, leaving interim Mayor Rebecca Lawson to deal with a municipal catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Lawson stood in the mayoral office, staring out the window at the swarm of national media vans parked on the lawn. Behind her, City Comptroller Daniel Higgins was frantically sifting through a spreadsheet that looked like a financial death warrant. How bad is it, Daniel? Lawson asked, not turning around. Higgins rubbed his temples, his face pale. It's a financial extinction event, Rebecca. The DOJ isn't just seeking criminal convictions. They are initiating a massive civil rights investigation into the entire city infrastructure. But that's not even the worst part. When the news of the FBI raid broke this morning, The floodgates opened. "Explain the floodgates," Lawson commanded, finally turning to face him. "Every single person who was ever arrested, assaulted, or framed by the 9th Precinct over the last decade just found their golden ticket," Higgins explained, his voice shaking. "Our legal department has received a notice of intent to sue from over 60 different victims in the last 12 hours. The precinct's actions invalidate hundreds of past convictions. People who have been sitting in state prison on planted evidence are going to be released, and they are going to sue the city for millions." Lawson felt the blood drain from her face. "Our liability insurance dropped us at midnight," Higgins interrupted grimly. "They invoked the intentional criminal acts clause. We have no coverage. The city is solely responsible for every dime of civil restitution. The legal team has run the projections. If we fight these lawsuits individually in front of sympathetic juries, we will easily face $50 to $60 million in damages. It will bankrupt the city. We won't be able to pay for trash collection or keep the streetlights on. So what is the alternative?" "We settle," Higgins said, slamming a thick folder shut. "We establish a global victims compensation fund. We offer an immediate blanket payout to bypass the courts. $10 million. Cash. Right now." $10 million, Lawson gasped, leaning heavily against her mahogany desk. "Where do we get $10 million? We liquidate the municipal emergency reserve. We freeze all city hiring. We slash the parks budget. And we strip the pensions from every single officer implicated in Operation Glasshouse," Higgins outlined ruthlessly. "We burn the budget to the ground to save the city from going into federal receivership." The sheer gravity of Captain Briggs's arrogance had finally quantified itself. The ego of 17 men was going to cost the taxpayers $10 million. 6 months later, the circus finally culminated in the grand, wood-paneled arena of the United States District Court. The trial of Captain Edward Briggs had captivated the nation. The media had dubbed it the Blue Wall Collapse. While 16 of the officers, including Miller, Trent, and Jensen, had taken plea deals to save themselves, Briggs's narcissism refused to allow him to yield. He had hired Leonard Hastings, a high-priced, aggressive defense attorney known for pulling off courtroom miracles, paid for by the remnants of Briggs's hidden extortion money. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Federal Judge Samuel O'Rourke, a no-nonsense jurist with a notoriously low tolerance for police corruption, presided over the bench. Hastings based his entire defense on the concept of federal entrapment. His strategy was to paint Special Agent Daniel Brooks not as a victim, but as a manipulative saboteur who had specifically provoked the officers into making a mistake. When Daniel Brooks took the witness stand on the 5th day of the trial, the courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. His demeanor was exactly as it had been on the hood of the police cruiser, calm, clinical, and completely unbreakable. Hastings paced in front of the jury box, aggressively pointing a finger at Daniel. "Agent Brooks, you were deliberately dispatched to the 9th Precinct's jurisdiction to bait my client's officers, were you not? You refused to identify yourself. You antagonized them. You manufactured this entire crisis to justify a federal takeover of local law enforcement." Daniel leaned into the microphone. "I sat on a public bench, Mr. Hastings. I possessed a bottle of iced tea. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a sudden movement. And I did not violate a single municipal statute. If sitting quietly on a Tuesday afternoon is enough to bait a police department into committing felony assault and attempted murder, then the department was already functioning as a criminal enterprise." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. The judge banged his gavel to restore order. Hastings sneered. "You expect this jury to believe that Captain Briggs, a decorated 30-year veteran, just randomly decided to threaten your life? It was the opening AUSA Margaret Donovan had been waiting for. "Redirect, Your Honor," Donovan said smoothly, standing up from the prosecution table. She walked to the center of the room, holding a small digital audio player. Mr. Hastings insists his client's actions were merely an overzealous attempt to maintain public order. Let us listen to exactly how Captain Briggs maintained order. Donovan pressed play. The audio from Daniel's hidden wire, digitally enhanced and crystal clear, echoed through the massive courtroom speakers. The jury listened in horrified silence as they heard the sickening thud of the initial assault. They heard Officer Miller's mocking laughter. They heard the claustrophobic panic of Officer Jensen discovering the federal lock on the computer system. And then, the chilling, unmistakable baritone of Captain Edward Briggs filled the room. This man was never here. He never existed. We execute him. We burn the teeth and fingertips and we dump him in the quarry. If he leaves this building breathing, we all go to federal prison. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. In the defense chair, Captain Briggs stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his face a mask of ruined pride. He didn't look at the jury. He knew what was in their eyes. He saw the same disgust that the entire country felt. It took the federal jury exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes to return a verdict. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Edward Briggs, guilty. On the count of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of racketeering and extortion. The word guilty echoed 42 times in the courtroom. 2 weeks later, Briggs stood before Judge O'Rourke for sentencing. He wore the same orange jumpsuit his subordinates had worn, his hands shackled to his waist chain. "Edward Briggs," Judge O'Rourke began, his voice dripping with righteous contempt. "You were entrusted with a badge, a gun, and the sacred duty to protect the vulnerable citizens of this city. Instead, you transformed your precinct into a sanctioned cartel. You preyed upon the very people you swore to defend. You operated with a level of arrogance and sadism that betrays the very foundation of a civilized society." O'Rourke adjusted his glasses, looking down at the broken man. "You believed that your badge made you a god. Today, the law reminds you that you are merely a criminal. You are sentenced to 45 years in the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. You will not see parole. You will not wear a uniform again. You are remanded to federal custody." The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Federal marshals grabbed Briggs by the arms and dragged him toward the side door. He didn't fight. The fight had been entirely crushed out of him. As he disappeared through the heavy oak doors, the era of the 9th Precinct officially ended. In the aftermath, the city of Monroe was fundamentally transformed. The $10 million global settlement was officially authorized by the City Council. The funds were distributed among the dozens of victims who had suffered under Briggs's regime. The falsely imprisoned, the beaten, the harassed. The money could never buy back the years stolen from them, but it was an acknowledgement of their pain, a tangible admission that the city had failed them. 17 badges were melted down. 17 pensions were completely revoked. The funds diverted back into the city to help pay for the massive settlement debt. Officer Miller received 15 years for his brutal assault on the street. Detective Trent received 12 years for his role in the cover-up and falsification of documents. Officer Jensen, who had provided the initial cooperating testimony, received 7 years in a low-security facility, forever marked as a traitor by his former brothers, yet saved from dying behind bars. Operation Glasshouse became a legendary case study in FBI academies across the nation. Special Agent Daniel Brooks returned to the shadows, his face never appearing on the news, his real name never printed in the papers. He quietly took his next assignment, slipping back into the crowds, a ghost in a grey t-shirt waiting on a bench, always ready to test the integrity of those who carry a gun and wear a star. The $10 million burned a hole in Monroe City's budget for a decade, a massive, painful scar that served as a daily reminder to every remaining public official. Power without accountability is just a prison sentence waiting to happen. The asphalt on 5th and Elm eventually cooled, but the fire ignited that Tuesday afternoon had successfully cleansed the rot from the city, leaving behind a hard, enduring lesson paid for in badges and millions. If this story of ultimate justice made your blood boil and your heart pound, you are not alone. The arrogance of the 9th Precinct cost a city $10 million. But watching corrupt officers finally face the crushing weight of the law is a victory we all need to see. What would you have done if you were Daniel Brooks on that hood? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget